If your country doesn't go along with whatever policies the EU Commission is pushing and uses its veto power to stop that policy, then you are said to be undermining democracy. That is the argument that EU Commission Vice President and High Representative Kaja Kallas recently made. If you oppose Brussels on its hawkish foreign policy, its push for deeper integration, its influence over national economies, or even broad policy areas like migration and the resettlement of immigrants, then you are cast as the obstacle. Hello, I'm Michael. This is Southern Realism, a channel about power, geopolitics, and decline. Imagine being told that if you don't go along with everyone else, then you are the problem. If you frequently use your nation's veto to oppose EU policies that harm your country, then you are the problem. That is the assumption behind Kaja Kallas' remarks. EU elites such as her increasingly define democracy as the will of the collective rather than the consent of distinct nations. They hold ever-increasing power over the European continent, and your role in her system is to fall in line. Now, I'm sure this will shock you, but Kallas is openly advocating removing the national veto. That would reduce the nations of Europe to something closer to subordinate regions within a larger political structure. We're definitely moving in that direction. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen thinks along very similar lines. She recently said, "We must succeed in completing the European continent. We must think bigger." Completing the European continent. Well, in practice, that means deeper integration, fewer vetoes, probably the removal of the veto power, and more unified political power in Brussels. Former European Council President Charles Michel, himself no opponent of EU power, has described von der Leyen as authoritarian and even super authoritarian. And that tells you something. This is not a fringe view. It is a growing mindset among EU elites, even if it's often wrapped in the language of democracy and strategic autonomy. Power is concentrating. That's the natural tendency of power. It expands. It seeks to reduce resistance. The veto is not an accident. It's a mechanism, an instrument designed to protect the distinct interests of nations within that system. Yes, it creates friction. It slows power down. Remove that veto, and you don't just make decisions faster, you shift power upward, away from the people, away from the nations. Now, Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen are not just making arguments about procedure. They're pushing hard in this direction. We're watching this shift happen in real time in Brussels. Unsatisfied with a common market, unsatisfied with free movement, unsatisfied with a single currency, unsatisfied even with the use of sanctions to pressure member states. Now we're at the point where resistance itself, the ability of a nation to say no, is being reframed as the problem. And once that happens, sovereignty is no longer a balancing force within the system. It becomes an obstacle to be removed.